Hello, hello. All right, folks, we're going to get started. So our topic today, Money Talks, connecting what you learn with what you earn. So we've got a bunch of statistics, and I'm going to throw out a couple questions. We're going to look at this and see if we can understand this connection between high school and college and careers in the workplace. So I'm going to start with there's a McKinsey study that is just out, and for the first time ever, they say worldwide the young are 3 times more likely than their parents to be out of work. There are 75 million youth unemployed, and they predicted, they hypothesized that there's about 250 million youth underemployed, that they're getting a college degree and acting as a barista, as they put it, so they think that there's just this massive, huge, untapped talent pool in the world, and that if you don't figure it out, it leads to social unrest and all kinds of big problems. So my first question for the panel, and we're going to start with a couple, and we'll just sort of get some quick pulses, and then I might have a couple for you. But let's just talk about this sort of this crisis. One more statistic I'll throw at you. There's 13.5 million people unemployed here in the United States, but yet 3.5 million open jobs. So there's this giant, what they call eduployment gap. So the education to employment connection isn't working. So our panelists come from different worlds, from Department of Education, Lumina Foundation, CEO of Charles Schwab Industry, Cornerstone On Demand. And so what I'd like to do, maybe Sherry, we'll start with you and talk about first question. What do you think about this eduployment crisis, this education to employment crisis? Any thoughts or perspectives on what the burning issues are as we sort of just first start to unpack this monster?
I don't know about burning issues. I know that at Lumina Foundation, we try to unpack those kinds of statistics and also look at them comparatively. And when you look at sort of disaggregate those by skill level and educational level, the story is a little bit more complex and actually a lot more positive in some respects, right? So if we look at the period since the end of the recession, people who have associate's degrees, the number of job growth since the end of the recession, it's been, by our estimate, about 1.6 million. And so it's almost recovered to pre-recession levels. And for those who have bachelor degrees, we've got 2 million more jobs available than we did before the recession hit. And so that is recovered to the same level. But that same level of recovery of jobs available is not available to those with only a high school diploma. So the question is, in those middle and lower middle skilled levels of employment and what we're supposed to do about that's those segments of the population. That's what I would suggest would be the refocusing of your question.
Yep, okay, good. And then just a comment to build off that, Sherry, in that they predict that by 2020 there's going to be an 85 million shortfall for high and middle skilled workers, that there's just a big gap there. So Dave, any thoughts on from a business and industry perspective, the idea of higher education? Are they churning out what the world needs right now? The statistics say no. What do you say?
You know, I host a dinner every fall for a bunch of students at a school that I'm deeply involved with, which is the University of Pennsylvania. And so last fall, so here's a bunch of students. There were 10 students at this dinner. I asked them, how many of you are in the college versus in Wharton? 9 out of 10 were in the college, so just studying for a bachelor's in liberal arts. And I said to them, how many of you are taking or plan to take a course in accounting? Nobody raised their hand, except, of course, the student from Wharton. And I said, well, I said, how many of you are planning to go to work for a company? Everybody raised their hand, as opposed to like becoming a teacher or going to work for the government or something. A company. So they're all going to work for a company. Okay. So I said, if you were planning to go to work in Italy, would you study Italian? And they all said, of course you'd study it. Of course you'd study Italian. I said, well, what do you think the language of business is? The language of business is accounting. It's numbers. You have to understand P&Ls. You have to understand balance sheet. You have to understand expenses and revenues. You have to understand how this stuff works. You got to speak the language. If you're lucky enough to get a responsibility of any importance, you'll get a budget. You have to understand budgets. You have to understand how this stuff kind of works. What do you think of that? And they said to me, every one of them, well, nobody ever told me that.
Yeah.
So what they graduate with is a degree, which is a certification that I can think, that I can compete, that I can stay up all night to deliver a term paper the next morning, that I'm highly motivated and I'm highly bright and competitive. And that's a big deal. And it's a big deal. And so coming out of Penn, we're still getting pretty good employment numbers. But they're not skilled. And it's sad, and we're letting them down. And one of the reasons for that is that you have either the point of view that, well, we're not a trade school. Our job is not to make people employable. Our job is to stimulate their mind, all right? And then you have the issue that the academic makeup of colleges is determined by the faculty who are protecting the status quo because they don't want to see the German department shrink, even though very few people want to learn German these days or care about the medieval German literature. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying we have to be responsive to what we need to learn to go forward in the world. And I think our classic universities are just letting our kids down.
And so, Dave, just build on that real quick. What do you think is the fate? You described that from the perspective of a tier 1 institution. So if you think about a bell curve, there's a top 10, a middle 70, let's say a bottom 20. So you just described the top 10% of the world.
Yeah, I think
what do you think the middles and the bottoms have to worry about?
I gotta tell you, so the top schools, they're okay. They're going to do fine, right? But the middle schools, and even more so the bottom schools, I mean, I think they're going to. I think that the new institutions that are going to be invented, or the smarter schools are going to figure this out, and they're going to say, you know what? We have to reposition ourselves, and we have to reposition ourselves now before we're at the bottom of the food chain and before nobody wants to come here anymore. And there are so many schools that need to figure out how to reinvent themselves, but the faculty at these schools are so powerful that administration finds it extremely difficult to get from here to there. And so those who figure that out, I mean, you'd almost have to fire all the faculty and start over. I mean, but who's going to do that, right?
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to watch. Patrick.
Right. Well, to build on that, it's not just the faculty and the institutions that have let people down. You're giving a group of people great advice. Where are their parents? I think some of the worst advice you can give a kid growing up is to find something you're passionate about and pursue it, right? And you'll be happy, right? They need to value work more. They need to get a job. I'm the youngest of 7 kids, and we've produced plenty of offspring. So we have 20 grandchildren amongst us for my parents, and they're all, some of them coming out of the top 10% schools, most of them, and none of them are working. None of them are working, and it's not until they get out of school, and literally one story, and I won't name her name so she can stay innocent, but my sister actually drove her. They live outside New York City. She drove her down to Washington, D.C., dropped her off at a friend's house, and left her and said, figure it out. You're not living at home anymore. Figure it out. And within a couple of weeks, she got a job as an administrative assistant or an executive assistant in the lobby of a building, and she started working, and then she got another job, and then she got another job, and guess what? Eventually, she discovered what she's passionate about. And now she's starting to pursue that, and while working, looking at how she can get to where she wants to be. But I do think sometimes we need to be a little bit more realistic with with children and give them better advice.
But you think the parents obviously aren't playing a strong enough role, and they're a contributing factor
They
to
are
this.
when the kids end up back at home.
Yeah, which is
After
where they
spending
are.
a couple of $100,000
Today they
on their-
live back in the basement.
Well, they should be. And I think we all need to be. And then the rest of us as business and community leaders need to reach out and do more of it.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
great, thanks.
Yeah.
Peter?
Well, I worked for Arnie Duncan for a long time and wrote a lot of speeches for him, and one of the big lines we used in those speeches was, find your passion. So I have to rethink that.
Find it while working.
I think you asked whether we have an educational problem. I think the bigger question to ask is whether we have an economic problem, or is it a combination of both? I don't think it's just an education problem. I kind of think that the whole marketplace doesn't work very efficiently, if at all. And by that, the marketplace that the communication from business to academia, I don't think is very fluid. The federal government paid a lot of money to help industry and community colleges get together and have industry help guide the development of curriculum, for example, in a number of places around the country. Typically, that doesn't happen organically. So it's not always clear that business is communicating what they need clearly. It's definitely not clear that, it's definitely, academia is not teaching what business needs, as Dave just pointed out. And I don't think students are choosing what they want, as you just pointed out. So you look at the whole marketplace, all the choices that are being made. What is business saying they need? What are schools teaching? What are kids choosing? I don't think that whole marketplace works efficiently, and I think it needs to work a lot more efficiently in order to be successful. I'll give you another example here. If you look at Manpower's website, the number one need right now is skilled trades. And we hear that the unemployment rate is highest among people with lower levels of education. On the other hand, you can develop a skilled trade at a pretty low level, maybe even high school, certainly associate degree in college. So again, the marketplace isn't working as well as it should.
Yep, so let me ask you a question. We talked a little bit, there's been some limited research on the idea of corporate college partnerships, right? So in the latest studies, there are some glimmers of hope where each side of this education to employment equation have walked in the other's shoes, and where they have seen that happen, tend to have really good things happen, right? So there are some better hiring practices and better connectivity, but the problem is the examples in the literature, in the research, even in the latest McKinsey study, they say we can find examples that are impacting hundreds, if we're lucky, thousands of people, and in fact we need to impact millions of people. So I'm wondering what ought to be done, given that we know that there are glimmers of hope. So I'd like to just ask this question, Peter, right back to you, and then Sherry, maybe you could comment. If we know there are some examples of where it works, why can't we do more? Why can't we fix this problem? We have some glimmers of hope. What's next, and how do we get it bigger? How do we get this to millions?
I mean, again, it's making the same point. I don't think it happens organically, that employers organically reach out to their universities or community colleges and work together. The Trade Adjustment Assistance Act, $2 billion that was passed early in the Obama administration, gave grants to community colleges to work with and in order to get the grant, you had to have the state, you had to have the community college, and you had to have the major employers all applying for the grant jointly. And so, for example, in Kentucky, you have this big partnership with the automotive industry. So they're working directly with the community colleges to shape the curriculum to produce people who can really work in the automotive industry. In Florida, you got it with the biotech industry. I might be getting that wrong. In southeastern Virginia, you have it with the healthcare industry. So they're actually just giving grants saying, guys, get in a room together and figure this out, because it just doesn't happen on its own, and that's what needs to happen.
Yep, okay. And Sherry, just a comment here
Sure.
from this McKinsey survey, 1/3 of employees never communicate with their employers never communicate with education providers. And those that do, only half have found it useful.
So, I mean, I'd like to push back a little bit and echo also what Peter said. I mean, again, it depends on what level of higher education and what tier of higher education you're talking about, and how you're basically categorizing business or the employer sector, right? So there are plenty of regions where community colleges are working extraordinarily interactively, and Peter mentioned just 2 or 3, but there are really many, many more than that. Any community college worth its salt that doesn't have a local office that is on the non-credit side of the house very frequently, but in fact is involved in worker retraining or worker training programs, work-to-order programs. I don't want us to think of that as being a diffuse and one-off kind of situation. That's kind of business as usual for community colleges. What I think you see on the side of the employers is, I think we have an articulation problem, and it might be on a couple of different levels. I think when we have who's speaking for business, whether it's the chamber, whether it's a local representation or an industry leadership or association, the question perennially is asked, and by the way, there's probably drawers and drawers full of high-level task forces and panels who weighed in on this. What do employers want from the workforce, right? That's the perennial questions every day, right? And the latest wisdom is, and understanding is, that employers may not be able to specify specific technical skills along the lines of the question you asked your students from Penn about accounting. But they talk about what we sometimes term soft skills, critical thinking skills, communication skills, ability to understand and adapt to new technologies, willingness to be trained, perseverance. Right?
Yep.
So a core of kind of attributes that we think of very highly and are sort of uniformly preparatory for almost any kind of career. Well, you know, liberal arts aficionados would say that's what the liberal arts do. That's what your students at UPenn represent, right? The ability to think, the ability to communicate, the ability to turn on a deadline, the ability to follow through, the ability to represent. But in actual fact, there are plenty of industries that have much, much clearer and with a lot more precise articulation. And what we don't have in this country is any kind of, and this is understandable, we're 50 states and a bunch of different territories, a uniform, well-articulated set of pathways for particular kinds of careers, right? We don't have an apprentice system like they do in Germany. We don't have formal guilds. Some industries and some professions are actually very structured and very clear. If you want to become a welder, believe you me, there's a very specified set of pathways you can go through. You can work it through your community college. Most of the time, welders actually are trained in community colleges nowadays, so I've learned. So you really do have to get down to the level of what industry, what profession, and what level of business we're talking about here. If you're talking about high-skilled people, you're talking about where you're finding the talent, that's a different set of problems than trying to figure out what exactly and how exactly to equip students who want to get a market-valued certificate, who want to get that first and second job. Those are two different sets of populations. Those are two different sets of problems. And all of our higher education institutions are not implicated in both of those. So, though they perhaps should be. So you've got a very, very complex tangle of players that we should always appreciate when we're talking about this.
All right, I'm gonna pick up on a couple of the comments about liberal arts. So just this month, so April of 2013, the Association of American Colleges and Universities did a study on what employers want, and the Chronicle of Higher Education separately did their own study. No surprise, both studies found that colleges are not doing a good job preparing graduates for work. But here was something interesting, and I'm going to pick up on this theme of this liberal arts thing, Dave, that you mentioned at Penn, Sherry, you brought up. Employers want a broad-based education, and they want it applied to the real world while they're in college. Next, they think that a 21st century liberal arts education is broad and teaches them to become broad and adaptive learners. So not this fixed, tight, very specific skill set, but back to this broad liberal skill set and personal and social responsibility and intellectual skills. So these are the needs. So what I'm wondering is, if you were thinking about hiring, and maybe Dave, I'll ask you this one, and Patrick, would you prefer a narrow skill set that's a perfect fit for the role today, or this sort of more broad, liberal-based critical thinking, problem solving? They might have a major in philosophy or art or literature, but they have the ability to think and reason and so on. So there's this sort of raging debate around, do liberal arts matter, do humanities matter? So Patrick, how about you first, and then Dave?
Well, I have as we discussed earlier, I had a direct experience with this when one of my first jobs as a manager was to create from scratch a technical support group for a very highly technical software product. And when we first set out the criteria, we hired technical people, and the failure rate was really high. And it wasn't until we started hiring English majors and anthropology majors and liberal arts majors and we figured that, you know, all the things that we know about what they need to know, we can teach them. It's all those other skills about interacting with people and especially communication skills. Communication skills were so critical to that position, and they were simply better at it than their specifically trained technical people. And so we had great success with it. We ended up, when we were finished with that group, it was, it was a fairly large group. We were handling thousands of calls a week. It was, and those people thrived in that environment. But the other thing that I think is so important, and over my career as a hiring manager, and I've been doing it for a long time now, is that I keep coming back to, you want people who want the job. You know, and it sounds so simple. I've given that
motivation.
I've given that advice to so many people. They go in and they're trying to, when they're interviewing, I said, make sure that the person you're interviewing with knows you want the job.
How do they demonstrate that?
There's a variety of different ways you can do it. The easiest way is to look a person in the eye and say, I want the job. It's not complicated. And they said, well, what if I don't want the job? So don't accept the offer.
Yeah.
Get the offer, but get a set of offers and then look through it and get a job, right? And so many of the people that I hire, the tough thing for me is I'm looking for potential today. When you talk about it, I'm looking for potential, and that's harder to identify. It can be easy to hide behind, well, they have this certificate, they have this degree, they went to this school, they've done these jobs, this is perfect, I've set up the criteria, they meet the criteria. Oops, my hiring rate is, success rate is below 50%, but I'm doing everything right? The harder thing is to look at and really identify people who want the job, are going to be passionate about it, are going to show up every day, enjoying the opportunity that they have and looking for more opportunities, and that can get along and effectively communicate with the other people that they have to interact with on a day-to-day basis. And if you can identify those skill sets, the success rate is very high. And believe me, I've had these arguments with my peers in different organizations, with my managers, with the whole way up the food chain, where they say, you're hiring who? For what? And the success rate is extremely high. I think.
So it sounds like with your perspective is we could solve a lot of this eduployment crisis if students were a little more motivated, a little more driven.
If they got better advice. I come back to this. I just think that too many of them, and especially, one of the very first things I look for in if it's a first or second job, I don't, they graduated, that's great. I want to see that they worked. I want to see that they worked. What did you do? Well, I was too busy doing this and this and this, so I didn't have time for work. Well, I want to see people who worked. And those types of things to me are really important. And I've had a fairly good success rate with that. And I encourage everybody to be a little bit more open, and in fact, some of the technology gets in the way of this, because people set up such strict prerequisites for jobs, and the applications are coming in, and when those requisites aren't met, they're not even talking to these people. They're not even giving people an opportunity, because they set up too many requirements to even cross the threshold and get an interview.
Yeah, there's an argument about that. Does the bachelor degree matter? Everybody says you have to have a bachelor's, and maybe for half these jobs you don't. But let me just turn it over to Dave. This broader liberal curriculum, Dave, in the 21st century, is that the next 10,000 people you'd want to hire that way, or do you rather get them out of business school with a bachelor's of business administration?
Well, I have a couple comments. Something that Patrick said I wanted to just comment on. I think someone needs to look the employer in the eye and not say, I want the job. I want to do this work. Yeah. The distinction is, I don't want to just get a job. I need a paycheck.
Right.
I'm excited to do this work. The employer needs to know, I want to do this.
Right.
I'm excited to do this.
Right.
I can throw myself at this. I think,
Do you think students know that, Dave? Just your opinion of you interact with a lot of students.
Well,
Are they
I-
capable of generating that level of passion and emotion? To
coming
know?
back to
Do they
something-
even know?
Something coming back again to what Patrick said. We need to give them better advice. And sometimes parents don't know how to do that. Schools need to have sort of career counseling offices that are staffed with people who know something.
Hold on, I got to write that down.
We can go now.
Not people who failed somewhere else in the university and they threw them into this department because they don't know what else to do with them, okay?
Yeah.
People that have actually been hiring managers and understand how a hiring manager thinks. How would they know? They never worked anywhere, okay? They don't really know. So if the parents can't do it, somewhere we have to give kids advice to understand that jobs, to explain why you can throw yourself at something. If I can just take a minute for a story. When I grew up in a lower middle class neighborhood. There wasn't a single white collar person on my street, not one. They were all firemen, factory workers, policemen, etc. So I never knew a business person, and I never knew what were those buildings in New York. I grew up outside of New York City. What did people do in those buildings? I had no idea. And one of my first, and so I had no career clarity on what I wanted to do. I looked at business and I thought, that's got to be boring as hell. I never knew how exciting it could be, how challenging it could be, how emotionally gratifying. Sales, I don't want to be in sales. Oh my God. Well, I was an athlete. Sales is where you win and lose every day. You have that satisfaction but no one ever explained it to me that way. No one ever positioned it to me that way. So we need to give our kids better counseling and to understand so that they can go into an interview and be excited about a sales job and understand that this is how you learn. The best way to become the president of the company is to start out in sales and understand the products and understand what the marketplace wants. It was a great place to start. A conversation I recently had with my son.
Me too.
As he was looking at a sales job, I don't want to do sales.
I was going to close with a question
I don't do sales.
on what
I'm
you all would
better than that.
advise your
I
kids.
graduated from an Ivy League school. I got to do sales. Are you kidding me? So I think there's two different kinds of companies. There's growing companies and there's stagnant companies. And when stagnant companies hire, they hire to fill a job. And that's the job you might be in for the next 10 years. If you're going to go into a growth company, they're looking at people who can grow, who can learn, who can progress. And I think that you need to be able to demonstrate your enthusiasm for the industry, the enthusiasm for that company, the enthusiasm to get started doing that work, and I'm ambitious and I'm going to kill myself because I want to impress my manager so he understands the potential that I have, and I'm committed to learning and growing myself. The responsibility to grow my career is on me. I have to learn, I have to grow. We don't even teach kids how to interview.
You represent the fire in the belly that is so the reason why you're the successful businessman you are, and your cry for basically the idea why can't everybody find themselves, right? Find their passion, find their business, find their dedicated route is a real one. And I, by the way, have my own problems with counseling at the college level, but which we won't go into. But I think there's a developmental issue and there's a time factor here in our country. We in fact have grown accustomed to allowing our late adolescents and young adults to find their way. That's what the liberal arts education actually is about, right? It's supposed to be about exploration, finding your passion, finding lines of inquiry, that one opportunity in a sense to opt out. This is the classical version of education, of course, that I've benefited from. Many other folks benefit from. But what we're finding is that has a very, the luxury of having that kind of time out and that period to grow, incubate, and flourish personally is now quite attenuated. What's interesting is, and I can tell stories about my own kids. One's 19, the other one's 24. What are they doing? One's in college, one's in law school. Why is he in law school? Can't get a job. Is he going to get a job after law school? We hope so. All right, right?
Business
I
schools never
I
did
bet
so
he
well
could.
than the,
I bet he will.
than the
I'm kind of betting
recessions.
that he will,
But he chose.
But he
to
chose
go
to do
law
it.
school.
He chose to go to law school, and he chose to try to find a career that way. And actually, he's found a passion, which I'm thrilled about. But I guess what I'm saying is that our society have had different levels of patience with late adolescents and young adults in terms of finding their way. And our higher education system is actually built in a rather complex way to respond to where people are in that. And the other thing, though, that we always neglect when we start talking about higher education and the employed is the fact that many, many, many more potential students and actual students of higher education, the output of higher education, really aren't 18 to 22 anymore. They really aren't. We have 36 million adults with some college, no degree. 36 million. And if they went back and completed their credential or completed their degree program, showed the fire in the belly that you were just demonstrating a minute ago, that would boost our middle and lower middle skilled workforce tremendously. We know that to be a fact. At Lumina, we've been trying to figure out ways to coerce, incent, divert adults back to finishing those degrees so that they can either realize their dream, both in terms of personal and professional satisfaction, but also in the real marketplace have something more to work with in terms of the credential. Did anyone here sit in the credential session that was like an hour ago? Did anyone hear one of the panelists there mention that they thought that certificates were the crack for higher education going forward? Did anyone hear that? Did anyone sort of have a reaction to that, I wonder? Because I know I did. The idea was those sub-baccalaureate degrees and credentials, those things that are below a BA, not quite an AA, those things like the specialty in welding or the specialty in healthcare or nurses, being the certification as a nurse's aide, what those mean and how those are a lift-off point are not for a career. That is actually what's at stake, and that's what's being contemplated by the majority of people in higher ed right now, because they're cheap to do, right? But there's a mass demand for them. All those 36 million adults, that's what they're going to be going for. They may be finishing their AAs and BAs, but first they are also certificate candidates for retraining. So you've got I guess the point is a lot of opportunity, a lot of entry points, and when we talk about who's entering where and how, we have to remember, again, who are we talking about here? When we talk about it at Lumina, we're talking about first-generation people, we're talking about returning adults. I'm not so worried about the folks at Penn. I'm not worried about the folks at Alma Mater. I'm not at my alma mater. I'm not worried about my kids. I think that they'll find their way. When I graduated in '81 from undergraduate school, we were in a deep recession, and 50% of my class moved back with their parents too. And as we've seen from the way the tracking has gone for that generation of workers coming out in the early 80s, we've all done fine. It was just a matter of time. So keep the time dimension in mind when you're thinking.
So Peter, let's, just going to go back to this question one last time about liberal arts. So a philosophy major makes his way onto the world stage in the U.S. Department of Education. What might he think about, that's his background, by the way, about this liberal arts debate versus being very vocational or even certificates, as Sherry alluded to?
I don't know. I was excited by the notion that philosophy majors and anthropology majors were getting hired to run companies. I thought that holds out a lot of promise. So.
Yeah. and the
Maybe design cars.
And the great thing is they were excited about it too. I mean, legitimately. I mean, they were.
I think, even on this panel, we hear a lot of different things. Dave started out with a good story about how all these guys were going into business, but they weren't studying accounting and how he thought they should. You said that you look for people with sort of critical thinking skills. You also said that employers have screening systems that screen out all kinds of people who have the very skills you're saying you might need.
Right.
So again, I go back to my first point, which is business clearly communicating what they want? And I know that that's not a one-dimensional thing. As Sherry pointed out, you have one level of problems employing Ivy League graduates. That's one problem, and it's pretty solvable. You have another problem employing adults who are trying to retrain. You have another problem with community college kids, low-income kids. So these are all different problems. They shouldn't be treated the same way. But again, I say, are we communicating clearly what kids should want? Certainly Dave said they need to show passion, although they need to be careful about pursuing their passion, right? So I just think that And the expectation that somehow parents are going to really be able to guide kids on this, I think is hard. Parents can certainly say a few things like, yes, you need to work hard, and yes, you need to finish and stay in school, but I don't think they know enough about the world to really give kids great advice. I think employers would be a much better source of real life advice if there was a channel for that to come through. I really think so.
Go ahead, Dave.
You know, when I was at Schwab, we would have relationships with the community colleges in where our call centers were, because we were always hiring teams of people, dozens of people every year. And it was good business for us to have the school understand, if you teach this stuff, these guys arrive having gone through training we would have had to do on our nickel while we pay them a salary. We would much rather have them take these stuff, and then we take the kids who've succeeded, who've gotten good grades, they've shown proficiency, they're interested, blah, blah, blah. So we had great relationships with community colleges, and I actually think the future of community colleges to play a better role, to even think more about this, is phenomenal. And it's a shame that somehow there's become a taint in going to junior college or community college in some parts of our society. The Ivy League will do fine. Where I think we struggle are kids coming out of fine universities that are not as selective, are not as prestigious, you might say. So graduating doesn't say that much about you, because it's frankly not that hard to get through. And you don't have any skills to actually do anything, and you have no idea what you want to do. And you graduate thinking, well, great, I'm a graduate now. And now what? And now what? You have no edge. My son got a job in Silicon Valley when he graduated last spring. And he said to me, Dad, I don't know why anyone coming out of college would want to work anywhere in the United States other than Silicon Valley. It's so exciting. It's so youthful. There's so much going on. The jobs are so great. Yeah, well, my son spent years in technology, so he could get a job in Silicon Valley because he combined a great degree with the fact that he actually took 10 years off before he did his degree and worked in technology. See, he had what the market wanted. So it's not that easy, frankly, to get some of those jobs. But I think
those are the 3.5 million open jobs nobody can fill.
Yeah, I think it's the middle schools that are not. It's these middle university and colleges that are teaching liberal arts, that graduating is not as difficult as it is from some of the more competitive schools, where you're out, and now you're not qualified,
Right.
And competitive in the job market.
Well, I read an article this morning, in fact, and I thought, well, it would be interesting. I think it was in Forbes, the 5 top things that startups are looking for. And you know what the number one thing was? Sales. The number one thing and I'm reminded of everyone that's ever worked for me knows, my favorite expression is nothing happens until somebody sells something, right? And I can tell you, I was actually in a sales meeting, big company, hundreds of salespeople, and that we had a speaker come in, as they do. They get the motivational speakers coming in, and they asked the room, how many of you want your children to grow up to be salespeople? And this was a room of salespeople. One person raised their hand. And this was a group of salespeople, and then the guy proceeded to show the statistics about earning and earnings and career paths and success rates and happiness quotients about marriage and children. And they said, how many people want to do this, right? And it was the same job, right? It was sales. And I do think that there is a communication problem about, like you said, people look at those big buildings and they don't know what's going on inside of them. And you know, I was one of them too until I got there. I had an engineering degree and I wanted to be in tech. I got a job as a programmer, working all those things. But until you start, how do you know, right? You got to get started somewhere.
Here's a response to what you just said. I looked up a statistic too before I came here. 350,000 people graduate with a business degree. and another 175,000 graduate with a master's of one kind or another in business. Do they teach sales
No?
in business school or in business degrees, a typical college business?
No,
No.
it's a skill, it's
Number
nothing.
one.
It's beneath them.
No?
Business
do.
business
Marketing.
schools, the top schools, strategy, innovation.
It can be, absolutely.
Yeah.
Arthur Miller really killed this whole thing, didn't he? But yeah, it's one of the biggest needs, and no
the
one's
other-
teaching it.
And I will say the other big skill that I do see lacking, and I've done a lot of entry-level hiring, is, I mentioned it earlier, is communication skills, and specifically writing.
Yeah.
Writing skills are horrible. Give everybody you ever interview a writing test.
So Plato
No matter
had it
what
right
their job
2,000
is.
years ago, right? Grammar, rhetoric, logic, dialectic. You had to be able to speak and you had to write.
Yeah.
And critical
That's
thinking.
basic.
So I'm going to summarize the whole liberal arts discussion as everybody get into sales. That's the lesson. So I want to move on quickly because we're going to rapidly run out of time. But
Major in anthropology, minor in sales.
got it. Get the sales skills.
Do a
But it's
major
hard
in
to find
philosophy.
good sales programs in schools. I'd love to see sales curriculum for philosophy majors. I think it'd be great. I think you will have one hell of a hard time ever finding that. And I don't mean sales as in a degree, but just get exposed to the discipline and what it is. I think there's so many interesting ideas. So here's what I want to build on and sort of move to the idea of our strengths in the United States. There's a lot of talk about the problem, right? We have the world's greatest higher education system. Undisputed heavyweight champ of the world. We have the world's most productive workforce. So our GDP per capita, we got 300 million people that do like $17 trillion worth of stuff every year. Really impressive. No one can hold a candle to us. And Peter Capelli is a professor at Wharton that covers this whole talent management space. Pretty well-known guy. He was at the Davos conference with the World Economic Forum. He said there's 200 million unemployed, so sort of rehashing that. He thinks that it's all about entrepreneurship can fix this whole problem. That's where all the new jobs are going to be created. In the USA, his opinion, because he spent a lot of time outside the country, everyone views the USA as the greatest place on earth, and that it's honorable to start a company in the USA. They believe that it's honorable. It's the best place in the world to start a company. But in these other parts of the world, it's distrusted. And he said a lot of it related to certain things like communist political systems, but it's very distrusted. So here's my question. So I want to think about, we've got some great strengths. How do we build on our strengths? And so I'm interested in the two business guys in the middle on how do we, what ought to be done to continue to further and build on our strengths for starting companies and building companies on entrepreneurship and on the outsides, this higher education system and this whole sort of ecosystem or marketplace, Peter, as you described from a public. So I'm going to ask you all to address that. So it's how do we take our strengths and get stronger? Patrick, then we'll go Dave,
right.
Sherry, Peter.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think I've also traveled around the world and on business and I agree with that assessment. Maybe not as glowing. I think there's some things that go on there, but absolutely we're doing things well, right? And I sometimes think that and I'm qualified to talk about this. I've lived inside the Beltway in Washington D.C. for most of my life, and the dysfunction in Washington, I think, just creates this environment that makes everybody believe that the country is just broken. And what's broken is the problem-solving mechanism in Washington, right? Meanwhile, there's fantastic things going on all over the country. And there was if you read The Economist, there was a great article they featured, a couple of months ago. I can't remember the exact name of the article, but they went through just a whole list of all the great trends and all the positive things that are happening around the country. And so I do think that sometimes the atmosphere in Washington, the absolute inability of legislatures to legislate, right? It just doesn't work. And I think that does color people's opinion about what's going on in the country. There's a lot of great stuff.
I'm going out of order.
Yeah.
Peter,
Well,
because you're going to build
this
right on
conversation
that.
was to start to talk about America's strengths, and Washington, I don't know.
He's our policy. He's our Washington
Yeah.
guy. So I thought,
Well-
given what you said, we're going to just switch over here.
I mean, I think there is a history of the federal government helping fund important areas of research that have contributed to lots of good things in medical research, allegedly the internet, I'm not sure. But clearly, things are broken there, unequivocally. It's interesting, we're in the Department of I was in the Department of Education for the last 4 years, and all of the money that we got to do anything to drive reform or to drive innovation, we got not because anybody wanted to pass it for education, but it was like attached to other things. Like we got some money through the Recovery Act, and then we got some reforms in student lending attached to the healthcare bill, and then we got some jobs money to help keep teachers employed attached to the war funding bill. So nobody has passed anything for education.
Right.
And in fact, we're going to try and do something right now for the first time. We're trying to get an early learning initiative passed, and we're going to have to pass it on our own, and we're like baffled about how to do it because it's just that the political will is not there. So absolutely, you're talking about something that's broken. But to go back to your question about whether we have strengths, it's funny. We send people, and just to be clear, I don't work there anymore. I've left the administration, but we used to send people all around the world to look at other high-performing school systems, and they'd go to South Korea and Singapore and Shanghai, which are always leading the world in these PISA studies, and it turns out that those kids, work 12 hours a day, and this memorization, and there's just a real culture of hard work, but they really wanted to learn from us about how we maintain creativity in the classroom. So they wanted to be more like us, and we wanted to be more like them. So I think creativity is one of America's great strengths. That is why we have entrepreneurs. That is why we lead the world in the economy and economically, and that is something we should not overlook. And our school systems should reinforce that.
Yep, all right, beautiful. Peter, Dave, how do we strengthen our strengths to make this the world's greatest nation? It already is, and start a business.
Well, I think the education we're delivering is great. It's missing something, and so the things we've been talking about. And wouldn't it be great if suddenly there was a movement where lots of colleges, at the end of the school year, everybody takes off, goes somewhere. Maybe at the end of the school year, after they've done all their liberal arts, there's a 4-week class, uses the dorms, uses the facilities, called Business Careers for Liberal Arts Majors. And we actually teach kids the skills they need. We teach them what these things are like. A lot of them are just like me.
Exposed.
They don't know what these careers are.
Yeah.
They don't know how exciting it could. They don't understand that sales can be exciting and fun. And we got to show them some of these things, educate them both on where the opportunities are, give them some skills, give them some perspective. And if we did this, maybe between their freshman and sophomore year, while they're finishing their liberal arts, they might take that accounting course, or take the course in economics, or take the course in communications, because now they start to understand that in addition to learning all these things I'm interested in, I need to prepare myself. So why don't we think about that between freshman year and sophomore year? We start taking kids, they go for 3-4 weeks, and they start to get oriented about the rest of their life.
So now I know why he's the CEO. So there's that's the next billion-dollar business opportunity
There
right
we
there,
go.
Dave.
There
You're
we
going to
go.
rent out college facilities for summers and teach
And there are
business
about
boot camps.
maybe
Go-
2 dozen in the house who can automate that for you and put it on a platform.
So Sherry, strengthen our. How do we strengthen our strengths?
Well, so at Lumina Foundation, we're kind of in the business of thinking hard and long about how we can line up perceptions, align power, act collectively to get our education system and our workforce systems working together more smoothly. And in fact, one of the strengths of our American system, it's a country of, I'm going to be, say flat out, this is against the usual sort of metaphor, but we are a country of second and third chances when it comes to education and career, even fourth chances. And that's one of our huge strengths. The other strength is this notion is when we get together, when we align our sectors, when we have a goal that we focus on collectively, we go gangbusters on that goal as a country. I mean, we really do know how to achieve. So the question becomes, how do we get everyone to line up? And at Lumina, we've been thinking a lot, and this is new, in some ways new thinking for a foundation that identifies itself as being an education foundation, only preoccupied with college access and success and very determined to get many more Americans to those quality credentials, right? That's what we're all about. But we cannot imagine going forward without employers at our side. And I don't think we would have been able to say that 5 years ago. And that speaks very much to this specter, this
huge.
vision of collective action, right? The good news, even better news, and another strength is that best practices around trying to educate the workforce within a company to try to be supportive of continued learning and training is already well practiced in many large companies that can afford to do so and see ahead. And I think clearly Charles Schwab would be in that category, but we could talk about Walmart, we could talk about a number of other, Bank of America, we could talk about a lot of other companies that have decided to really make this a major feature of the way they behave toward their workforce, the way they retain their best workers. But as something that we've talked about a little bit in advance of this meeting, at the middle-sized firm level, at the small-sized firm level, we don't really actually have that culture, or somehow that's viewed as a luxury, a resource and investment that isn't top of mind. And so at Lumina, we often, when we talk to employers, we work with the chamber, we work with individual industry leaders, we ask the same question we've been asking all day long about what do you want, but we also ask about they also ask us, what can we do? And there is a lot that employers can do, even if they're middle and lower level size. So I just thought I would just run through the obvious once again. There are co-op and apprenticeship opportunities that business can sponsor. I don't care if you're middle or small. There are tuition reimbursement plans, especially around prior learning assessment, which is a big, important element for returning adults. This idea that you can get credit and link into a community college or a university system based on your your work experience, either within your present corporation or previously held. If an employer values that prior learning assessment and will actually help reimburse the cost of assessing that prior learning, that's a huge benefit to employees, a huge benefit. Lifelong learning accounts, that's something that's present in some states and not in others. That's something, again, that employers are allowed to contribute to. And employers can be the ones who can actually also, and we'll be right alongside you, asking state and federal authorities for tax incentives to actually create those lifelong learning accounts that can be used for continued post-secondary education and training. And finally, and evoking once again that theme I just started with, which is employers have the ability and are incredibly important in locales, in places, when it comes to collective action and decision making. In places like Louisville, Kentucky, where they have a campaign called 55,000 Degrees, the corporate community is incredibly important in that activity. In Cincinnati, Ohio, where they decided to do a very large and ambitious effort around college and high school completion, but actually looked at the full pipeline of educational outcomes. They had corporate partners, big philanthropies, and the universities and K-12 systems sitting down together collectively. Employers have to be there at the table to talk about this, have to be willing to sit there as equals in some respects and engage. But this goes beyond corporate responsibility. It's good business.
So we are out of time. If you have a final thought, 30-second comment is our time slot. Anybody else says, as we bring this to a close? Go ahead, Patrick.
I would just like to add on to what you said, and I think it's so important. It's not about corporate responsibility. We need more leadership to make the economic argument that we need to take better advantage of all the human capital.
That's right.
Right? And I think too often it's done under this softer sort of corporate responsibility, or we have a moral obligation, and,
right.
I don't mean to discount that, but we have an economic obligation, and there's economic value to leveraging all the potential that's out there, and we're clearly not doing it.
Peter, 30 seconds.
I think business has to be a louder and more aggressive voice in advocating for educational investment. I think every dollar we invest in schools will save them money on the back end, will strengthen the economy, will pay off multiple times. So having their voice, whether it's for early learning, whether it's for high school rigor, whether it's for high standards, whether it's for college access, the business voice is critical.
Great, thanks. Dave, bring us home, close us out, and get these people off to lunch.
Well, quick final comment. Obviously there needs to be a connection between your education and what you're going to do afterwards. And it's amazing to me that people go through college and have spent no time really thinking about, well, when I'm done with this little bubble I'm living in, I have to actually go out and get a job. So somewhere in that process, there needs to be more help for our students. And I think somehow colleges have to realize that that's a piece of what they do. That's a piece of what they do. They're preparing people for the future, and that's how to be a thinker and how to be a doer, and I'll end on that note.
Thank you all very much, panelists. This was a great conversation. Thank you all. Thank you.
You're so well spoken.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
So much. My turn.